Specflow tutorial part 11 scenario context. In part 10 we have learned about a feature context. So in this session we are going to learn about what is a scenario context and its utilization. So let me start this session. Scenario context helps to get the information of the scenario. So if we talk about the information, the scenario name, the tags and other information related to a scenario, we are going to get it with the help of this scenario context. So scenario context is again an example of the context injection, like we have the feature context. So feature context is also an example of the context injection, and the scenario context is again an example of the context injection. When we are saying example of the context injection, it means we are not going to create the object of the scenario context class with the help of the new keyword automatically. Whenever we are mentioning this scenario context class in the constructor of any of the class, then automatically context injection, or you can say automatically a very simple dependency framework which the Specflow is going to use it is going to create the object and inject into the constructor of the class as well. So scenario context can be accessed during the feature execution. We can access in before scenario, after scenario, before step and after step. So scenario context help you to store the value in a dictionary. So let me flip to Visual Studio to understand with an example. So we have a Specflow session project, and this Specflow session project we have created in the previous sessions. So when we are talking about a scenario context is an example of a context injection as well. So scenario context is similar to the feature context, but if you talk about a scenario context, it is going to have the information related to a scenario instead of having a information like we have it inside the feature context related to a features. So whenever you want to have the scenario context, then what you need to do is we need to have a scenario context class, and this scenario context class is present inside a Specflow. So let's use this scenario context. We are saying SC. So scenario context object will be created automatically because we have added this scenario context in the constructor of the class, and we have added a one keyword which is this binding keyword. It means this particular web step class is going to be the Specflow class. And as per the rule of the scenario context is an example of another example of a context injection. We don't need to use a new operator to create the object. Specflow is going to create the object and add it in the constructor of the class. So now let's have this here. We are saying scenario context, and we can say SC, and then we are going to assign the value which we are getting it as a parameter here. So we are saying SC is equal to SC as well. So when we are talking about a scenario context is having other methods and a property. So say example, we are saying console.writeLine, and whenever you want to access the functionality or the methods of any of the class, we need the object, as we have already created the object, and here in this constructor we are assigning the object to the instance of the scenario context which is at the class level. It means we can use this here inside a before scenario as well. So let's use this. We are saying SC dot, and here is the scenario info properties. When we are saying dot, it is having a different methods and a properties. So description is going to provide the description of the scenarios. Another is we have the scenario and feature tags and only a tags as well. So this tags property is going to provide the tags related to a scenario. And if you talk about a scenario and a feature tags, so we are going to get the information, the tags, those are present on the feature file as well as along the scenarios as well. So we are going to use a title property to display the title of the scenario. When we are talking about a scenario context, we can access the scenario context in a different hooks as well. So we can access the scenario context here as well inside this after scenario. So let's have this scenario, and here is the context. So we can get the object of this particular scenario context class whenever we are adding the scenario context in the after scenario hook, before scenario hook, after step and the before step. So we cannot get the scenario context in the feature context hooks as well, or in the before test run and the after test run. So now we can also have this here console.writeLine. Just to check it out, we are saying scenario context dot scenario info and a description as well. So let's have a debug point here, and we can have a debug point here inside the before scenario as well. Let's have a build here. So if we see the build is going to be successful, the build is successful, there is no syntax error. Let's go to the test explorer. Right now we have two scenarios which existed here inside this particular feature file, which is this login with valid credentials. So right now we are going to execute this particular scenario only. So let's commit here to the test explorer, right click and say debug. Control has reached it here. So this is nothing but a before scenario, and we are using this particular scenario context which we have added it here inside a web step class constructor. So when we hover a mouse, we can see it is having this particular object. Let's hover a mouse on the title, we are getting the title as well. So when we are saying, we are going to also get the scenario context in the hooks as well. So let's go and click this continue, and it has logged in inside the website, and it is going to close this website, and we can see we are getting here in this particular after scenario as well. So if we hover mouse on the description, we are going to right now getting it null. The reason is we don't have a description of this particular scenario, and if you hover mouse on the scenario context, we can see the object is automatically created because the Specflow is using a very simple dependency framework, and the responsibility of the dependency framework is to create the object and inject it. We don't need to use a new keyword. So in this way we can use the scenario context here in the classes as well. So another concept related to your scenario context help you to store the values in a dictionary. So the like way we guys were using a feature context to save the values, and now we have the scenario context as well. So scenario context can also use to save the information. So but what is the scope of that particular value or that particular variable which is saving value? The scope of that particular variable is within this scenario. We cannot access the value of the variable outside in any other scenario. It means if we are adding any value to the variable here inside this particular scenario, then we cannot access the value of that particular scenario, of value of that particular variable here in any other scenario as well. So this is the main functionality of the scenario context. So right now if we commit here to this particular, let's go to the definition. Right now we are using a feature context, so instead of using a feature context, scenario context as well. So here we can say we are having this middle name, and in the middle name we can type a sync as well. So now what we are going to do is we are going to access this particular middle name value here inside this particular scenario. Right click on this and go to definitions. Right now if we can see, we have this feature context and we able to get the values. So is this possible to get the values here in another scenario which we have already added it in other scenario? So now what we need to do is we need to have a scenario context here. So we can have the scenario context. Again, we need to have this SC like we have added for the feature context. We need to have it at a class level. So here is a scenario context. Let's assign some values is equal to SC. Now we are going to have the scenario context. Let's commit here inside the scenario context, and if we talk about a key, so key is going to help us to get the values. And when we commit here inside the web step, the key is the middle name, and let's commit here, save it here, add it here as a key. So now what we are doing it here, we are using the scenario context to get the value which we have added it here inside this particular scenario. In this step we are adding the middle name, but we are trying to access the middle name here in this particular step of another scenario. Is this possible? Let's have a debug point here. Let's put it here, a debug point. Let's get rid of the debug point which we have added it. We don't need it. We are going to check a scenario context variable name. Let's have this and say debug. Has opened this browser and it has logged in inside a application as well. Now it is going to close the browser. It is again going to open a browser for us, but if we see it here, let's hover mouse on this particular feature context. We have the object, we have the object to the scenario context as well. But if we do it here, Let's have a add watch here. Right click and say add watch. Here is add watch, and we can see it is throwing an error. The reason is it is not having that particular key existed here inside this particular scenario context, because we have added this key in a first scenario and we are trying to access it here in the second scenario. So with the help of the scenario context, we can save the values, we can get the values as well. Another property related to a scenario context is a test error. So test error is another property which provides information about the error of the scenario. So in case if your step is getting it failed, and with the help of the test error property we are going to check whether we are getting any error or not, so which we have already covered in the previous sessions. So let's commit here inside steps after step. We have already added the scenario context and we are checking it. If there is a no null value, it means it is having some value, and then it is going to commit here. So in this way we can use a test error property of the scenario context to check whether we have any error related to a scenario. So that's it in this session.